Let's start by taking a look at problems for African Americans around the turn of the century. In 1900, 8 out of every 10 African Americans are living in a rural part of the country, many of them in the South, which means many of them are still facing that harsh economic situation of sharecropping. Also, we still have Jim Crow laws in place, which keep society segregated and keep African Americans in second-class conditions. And they continue to be disenfranchised. They continue to have the vote taken away from them through things like poll taxes and literacy tests. They also faced violence, mob violence, and sometimes even lynchings. And African Americans faced harsh labor conditions in railroad camps and sawmills and mines. They were in what's known as peonage. And peonage is basically like slavery. You sign a contract which allows for very harsh working conditions. Oftentimes, illiterate workers, some of them African Americans, signed these contracts that allowed them to be beaten by their superiors, that prevented them from leaving if they wanted to. There were armed guards preventing them from leaving the mine or the sawmill and going to find work elsewhere. When it came to organized labor, African Americans were discriminated from labor unions. They're kept out of the American Federation of Labor. And they also are earning less in the same job as white workers. Education is also a problem. Now, more African Americans can read by 1900. Illiteracy fell from 45% to 30%. But there are still huge inequalities in the facilities, in the teacher salaries, and in the educational materials when you look at white versus black schools. For example, in 1910, the state of South Carolina spent almost $14 on every white student per year. And they spent just over $1 on every African American student. As a result of these inequalities and problems in the African American school system, very few African Americans actually attended school in the South. It just wasn't worth it. These problems lead to what's known as the Niagara Movement. This is an organization. It's first a meeting of African American leaders led by W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk, which is a very important examination of what life was like for African Americans at this time. And at this meeting, these leaders of the African American community are going to pledge to work together, to protest, to demand that African Americans have voting rights, that they have equality and economic opportunity, that they have legal equality, and they're going to demand integration as well. That's the opposite of segregation. Here's what they said they wanted. So specifically, this is a rejection of Booker T. Washington's gradualist approach. Booker T. Washington is another African American leader who said that African Americans should work hard, that they should learn a trade, that they should keep their nose to the grindstone and earn. And the more they earn, white society will eventually have to accept African Americans because they will have become economically valuable to society. The Niagara Movement is a rejection of that gradualist approach. They're saying they need equal rights and they need equal education for African American youth. And the Niagara Movement is going to lead to civil rights movements later in American history. But there are continued challenges for African Americans. There are race riots in Atlanta in 1906 and in Springfield, Illinois in 1908. In both of these situations, white mobs invaded black neighborhoods and there were even lynchings. These events lead to the creation of the NAACP, led by this group of prominent, you could call them progressives of the time. Jane Addams and W.E.B. Du Bois are two that we will definitely talk more about. But John Dewey is a famous name, as well as these others. And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is the nation's most important civil rights organization for almost 50 years. And it's going to experience very rapid growth. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to lead the publicity for the organization as he is the editor of The Crisis, which is kind of the official newsletter or magazine for the NAACP. And they're going to pressure employers, they're going to pressure labor unions, and pressure the government for equality for African Americans. And they have some major success in the courtroom. In 1915, in this court case, the Supreme Court overturns a law that prevents African Americans from voting in Oklahoma. They got that law overturned, giving African Americans in Oklahoma a greater right to vote. In Buchanan versus Worley, they got the Supreme Court to rule that a law requiring residential segregation was unconstitutional. In 1918, during World War I, the NAACP and the National Urban League persuade the federal government to create a Bureau of Negro Economics as part of the Labor Department to oversee African American wage earners. That's another big step. They're getting the government to acknowledge that there's a wage gap for black earners. But African Americans are going to continue to suffer from disenfranchisement. They're going to continue to suffer from poor job opportunities, and they're going to continue to suffer from segregation.